Welcome to Historically Speaking. My name is Jayavardhan Singh, and in this podcast, we talk about everything that is history. In this space, I'm going to talk about Brahmi and its origin. So we will also look at how the name Brahmi itself arrives. So first of all, some basic introduction about the Brahmi script. So most of the Indian script which we presently have is derived from this Brahmi script. The earliest reference or earliest evidence of this script dates back to around 3rd century BC. And now there are other evidence which some believes that they date to around 4th century BC, but there are great disagreement about the whole issue. But what we can say is that it is during the Mauryan period, and particularly according to most scholars that it was during the reign of the Mauryan Emperor Ashok that we find for the first time Brahmi script was extensively used to write Ashokan edicts. Now, sorry for the wrong pronunciation. It is Brahmi, not Brahmi. So the name Brahmi itself, we scholars do not necessarily agree whether in the Mauryan period this script was called Brahmi. And we do not have any reference to suggest that the Mauryans, for example, called this script which they used Brahmi. So how this name of the script Brahmi came. So the story of how the name Brahmi was given is quite interesting. So during the initial phase when the British scholars and antiquarians started to learn more about the ancient Indian history. And in the early phases, what we see is that they described this script as Southern Ashokan, Indian Pali, Mauryan script. So these were the different names of this script. And these were, continued up to the late 19th century. But what we see is that it was, the name Brahmi was first suggested by a French Indologist named Tene de Lecouperie. So to understand Tene de Lecouperie's argument, I think we have to first talk about some texts. So first we have this text, a Buddhist Mahayana text which was written in Sanskrit called Lalit Vistar. So Lalit Vistar, according to most scholars, dates back to around 3rd century AD. The 10th chapter of this text titled Lipishala Samdarshan Parivarta. So this chapter tells us that in Buddha's schooling, not exactly schooling in the modern sense, but during his education, Buddha mastered 64 different forms of writing. And here the list of the 64 scripts, first name is Brahmi. Now, so this is about Lalit Vistar. And when we move to, now there is another important text to understand how this, the name Brahmi itself came. So this is a Chinese Buddhist encyclopedia, although I will butcher the name, but the name is something like Fa Yuan Chu Lin. Now here, the list of these 64 letters, 64 script which the Buddha is believed to have mastered is also given. And here also, Brahmi is at the top of the list. And this text also tells us a story about how the writing was invented by 3 divine powers. So first we have Brahma. So Brahma invented Brahmi. And this Brahmi, according to this Chinese Buddhist encyclopedia, was written from left to right. Now this is an important fact because it will help to identify which script is Brahmi or not. The second script which was invented by the second divine power was Kharosthi. And this script was written from right to left. The third script was the Chinese name which I have is Sam Ki. And this script goes up and down. So these were the 3 scripts that are mentioned in this Chinese Buddhist encyclopedia. Now what Lecouperie did was he argued that in the Ashokan inscription which we have, the script which is written from left to right is called Brahmi, because in the Chinese Buddhist encyclopedia, this text tells us that Brahmi is the script which is written from left to right. So he gave this script the name Brahmi, And for the script which is written from right to left, he gave the name Kharosthi. So that is how the name Kharosthi and Brahmi came into being. Now, it could be the case that the Mauryans also called this script which is written on their inscription and which goes from left to right Brahmi. But there is no way for us to conclusively prove this. It is an argument or it is a speculation. I think in my view, it is a plausible explanation of the name Brahmi, but there is no way for us to prove because there is no evidence for that. Now, another important point which I think we should talk about is that now Kharosthi is also the same case. You know how in the case of Brahmi we have names like Southern Ashokan, Indian Pali, Mauryan script, etc. for Brahmi. So for Kharosthi also you have the names like Bactrian Pali or Aryan Pali. So these were the names which were given to Kharosthi before Lakupri argued that this script could be called Kharosthi. And that is how this name came into being. Now the term Brahmi itself does not only appears in the Buddhist text, because what we find is that if we talk about Jain text, so we have two Jain texts called Pannavana Sutra and Samavayang Sutra. So these two texts of the Jain tradition, they provide us a list of 18 script. And here in this list, the first name is Brahmi. Then there is also the famous Bhagavati Sutra of the Jain tradition. And here also we have a script which is called Bambhi Lipi. Libi, not Pa, it is Libi. So scholars believe that it is basically a corruption of the term Brahmi. Now, on a side note, I think it is an important story about the naming of the term Brahmi. There is some 2 years back, there was this story in the Indian Express. So this story talked about a controversy in Maharashtra, where the Pali textbook of class 12th, they had changed the name from Brahmi to Dhammalipi. So this was a great controversy, and those who supported this change that it should not be called Brahmi but Dhammilipi. So they argued that this guy, this French Indologist Albert Taneda Lucupri, was, and I quote, biased in the sense that he started naming all these scripts as derived from Lord Brahma. Now I think if the poor French Indologist got all the blame, but if we look that it is the Chinese Buddhist encyclopedia which is to blame for this naming of how the term Brahmi was named. So anyway, this is on a side note, but what we should consider is that the name Brahmi itself is we ascribe this name recently. Earlier, we are not sure whether the Mauryans or in the later period, this term was used for this script. Now, coming to the question of the origin of Brahmi script. And here, in order to understand the different theories, we have to understand why the different theory exist. So the problem which we have, in particularly when we talk about the history of different scripts in India, is that we have the Indus Valley script. Now there are some scholars who argue that it was not necessarily a script, but I do think that it was some kind of a script. So by the time of, now this is a broad estimate, so around 1500 BC we have most of the Indus scripts are not being produced or are not being used. And from 1500 BC to, let's say, the Mauryan period, we have this gap where there is no evidence to suggest that some kind of language or some kind of script existed in India or it was practiced in India. And around the Ashokan period, we have suddenly a script that is to a certain extent quite mature. So this emergence of Brahmi script, and that too, the maturity of this script raises certain important questions. like how this script evolved and what was the origin of this script. So in order to explain this, we have multiple theories. And what we see is that these multiple theories can be divided into two, uh, two groups. So first, there are a number of scholars who argue that Brahmi had a foreign origin. So this is the first group. Then the second group, which argues that Brahmi had indigenous origin. Mainly it was developed and originated in India, and there was no external influence. So this is the second group. Now, I think before I talk about the foreign group, but some basic point is that foreign origin theory are the earliest theories, because it was the British and other European antiquarians who started for the first time under the study of ancient Indian scripts. So we find that it is the foreign origin theory which was first became popular. But I will start with the Indian origin theory. So in most cases we find that it is these are the Indian scholars who argue this point or argue about this theory. So first we have but that is not always the case. We find that there are, and I will give you some examples of non-Indian scholars who have talked about this theory or who have supported this Indian origin or indigenous origin theory. And here the first, and I think a quite famous scholar and archaeologist is Alexander Cunningham. I think most of us know about who Alexander Cunningham was. So Alexander Cunningham argues that there was this original pictographic script which later developed into Brahmi. Now this pictographic script was not the Indus Valley script. So he is not talking about the Indus Valley script. So we should keep this in mind. So what Alexander Cunningham basically argues is that there was a original pictographic script that was used by the Indians, and to a certain extent, here Alexander Cunningham is not exactly a scholar who believes or who argues about the completely indigenous origin of the Brahmi, because he argues that this pictographic system, the earliest form of pictographic system that developed in India was, and I quote, this system must have borrowed something from Egyptians. So here, the argument of Alexander Cunningham does not necessarily fall in the indigenous origin camp, but his broad argument is that this pictographic system was later evolved into Brahmi, and this evolution was not necessarily influenced by any external influence. So this is the argument of Alexander Cunningham. Then there is this scholar called John Dawson, and John Dawson basically argues that he does not talk about this pictographic script or system which Alexander Cunningham had talked about. So he basically argues that this Brahmi script originated in the Gangetic plains, and the reason which he gave for this indigenous origin is quite simple. He argues that there are inherently peculiar features of the Indian alphabet, and these peculiar features are not found anywhere else. So the script which is developed was in accordance with this whole Indian linguistic system, and this was originated in the Gangetic plains. Now there are, now coming to Indian scholars, for example, I think most of us have heard the name K.P. Jaiswal and G.H. Ojha. So these two scholars, for example, argued that, first of all, they argued that, how suitable this script is for the, Indian languages. And that is why the broad argument of these two scholars was that Brahmi originated in India. And another a sub branch of this whole camp of indigenous origin is the fact that Brahmi evolved from the Indus Valley script. So the first scholar who worked on or who introduced this idea was S. Langdon. And he was the first to argue that there is this some type of connection between the Indus Valley script and the Brahmi script. And later we have scholars like the great scholar DC Sarkar, who argued about this fact that Brahmi evolved from the Indus Valley script. Then you have the great scholar who recently passed, Bibi Lal. So Bibi Lal also supported this theory that Brahmi developed in India, and it did not was influenced by any other external influence. So these are some of the theories that is presented by the camp which believes that Brahmi originated in India and it is an indigenous development. Now those who do not support this theory, they basically argues that there is no way for us to prove that Brahmi originated in India. Like if we want to have some early references, for example, there are no early reference. So since we do not have any early reference, there is no way to confirm whether these theories are true or not. And for example, in the case of IVC, the Indus Valley Civilization script, which was used in the Indus Valley Civilization, we do not have the know-how to read the Indus Valley script. So to say that this Indus Valley script later evolved into Brahmi cannot be explained basically. Now, this is the first camp which believes that Brahmi originated in India and it is of indigenous origin. Now, coming to the foreign origin camp. So first we have the famous scholar James Prinsep, who deciphered this script. So James Prinsep argued that there is this connection that exists between the Greek script and the ancient Indian script. Now, to remind the listeners that by this time, scholars didn't call this script Brahmi. So that is why James Prinsep didn't talk about the Brahmi script. He talked about the Indian script. So Prinsep has this idea that there is this some connection between the Greek script and the Brahmi, or in his case, the Indian script, by which he meant Brahmi script. But then there is this another scholar called K. Mueller. So this is not Max Mueller. This is a different Mueller. So he basically argues that Brahmi script originated from the Greek script. And his argument was pretty simple. He argued that it was the invasion of Alexander that brought the Greek script into the Indian subcontinent, and it was Alexander and his army which accompanied him that led the introduction of writing into India, and that is how the Indian script was derived from the Greek script. So this is the argument of another Mueller, K. Outfrid Mueller. So this was the name of the scholar. And what we see is that this theory was later, applied not only for the Greek, but there are scholars who believe that three languages helped in the evolution or origin of Brahmi. So first we have the Greek script, then we have the Aramic script, and finally the Kharosthi script. So these three scripts helped in the development of Brahmi script. Now Kharosthi is an Indian script, but there is, I think the present consensus among scholars is that Kharosthi was developed or was derived from the Aramic script. So in the case of Kharosthi, there is no such debate. So the basic argument of these scholars is that it was the Aramic and Greek, and to some extent Kharosthi, that led to the origin of Brahmi. One scholar who have particularly argued that it was predominantly the Kharosthi script that was the basis for the origin of Brahmi is H. Falk. So we will talk about him in a later period. So then you have this argument of Greek, Aramic, and Kharosthi. Then there is also an argument famously from George Buehler. So Buehler is a great personality in the Indian paleographic tradition. So he basically argues that it was the Phoenician script that was responsible for the origin of the Brahmi script. I think the most interesting theory in particularly this camp is the Aramic, and how uh, Aramic helped in the origin of Brahmi. So basically, what we see is that the scholars who argues about this theory, they argue that if you look at the historical map of, let's say, 5th century, 4th century BC, so here you will see that next to the Indian subcontinent, you have the great Achaemenid Empire, and Aramic is the lingua franca of the Near East and the Iranian world, and it is also the bureaucratic language of the Achaemenid Empire. And we also know that Achaemenid Empire controlled some parts of the Indian subcontinent. And from this, we can also say that there is this great influence of Achaemenid, particularly in the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent. And that is why, because of this influence of the Achaemenid Empire, we have this development of the Kharosthi script. So most scholars are of the opinion that Kharosthi script was derived from the Aramic script. So we have all of this situation in front of us. So it is not entirely wrong for us to believe that maybe it is the Brahmi script also that was derived from the Aramic script. And here I think the most interesting theory is by a scholar called Harry Falk. So he basically argues that the Brahmi script originated in the Mauryan period, and it particularly during the reign of Mauryan Emperor Ashoka. So his argument is basically that the Brahmi script was intentionally created on the model of Kharosthi and Greek. So this, so why he has put this Greek script in there along with the Kharosthi. So he have great points about why that is the case. But one point which he mentions, and I think it is quite simple to explain, is the fact that if you look at the Brahmi character Tha, so Tha is a circle, and in the circle there is a dot. So this is the character of Tha in Brahmi, and the same or somewhat similar character is the Greek character Theta. So both have the same use for the sound Tha. So because of this, he argues that there might be some influence of Greek on the Brahmi script, and particularly if you look at the way numerals are written, and also the way Greek script was used for inscription, and we also see that Brahmi was also used for inscription. So that is why he believes that Kharosthi and Greek both played an important role in the development of Brahmi. Now, this point is also taken by another Indian scholar, but he is of the camp of indigenous origin. So we have a scholar called Sriram Goyal. So Sriram Goyal argues that the Brahmi developed during the Mauryan period, and it was the work of Indian grammarians. So he does not talk about the fact that it was Kharosthi and Greek that led to the development of Brahmi. For him, it is the work of Indian grammarians, and there was no external influence. So this was the argument of S.R. Goyal. But basically, both Harry Falk and S.R. Goyal are of the opinion that it was during the Mauryan period, and most likely during the reign of King Ashoka, that Brahmi originated. Now, there is a important assumption that is made when these scholars talk about the fact that it was during the Mauryan period that Brahmi originated. So the first assumption, and it is quite an important assumption that is made here, is that before the coming of the Mauryas, there is no script. So this is an assumption which we could make, because it was during the Mauryan period that Brahmi originated. So before Brahmi, which script was used? So in that sense, one could say that there is this assumption that before the coming of the Mauryas, there was no script. But if you look at the literary sources, so we find that there are great references of the fact that some kind of script and the writing system existed. So you have in Chandogya Upanishad there is this word akshar. Then in Taittiriya Upanishad, you have Varna, Matra, these terms are mentioned. And if you look at Panini's Ashtadhyayi, you have the term Lipi itself. Then there is also, in Pali texts, for example, the early Buddhist text, particularly the three Pitaks. So Pitak literally means basket. So basket for what? You are putting some type of manuscript in the basket. That is why it is called basket. So the term Pitak itself suggests that some type of document was kept in the basket, and that is why the name Pitak itself comes. Then in the Vinay Pitak, you have terms like Lekhak, Lekhapati, and there is a letter game which is called Akharika. So these, mention these terms that are mentioned in Vinay Pitak. Then you have in Angutar Nikaya terms like Pothaka. So Pothaka is, according to some scholars, is the term for book. So these terms are mentioned in the variety of Indian literature or Indian text. So this suggests that there was a writing tradition, and the people were not illiterate before the coming of the Mauryas. So this is entirely clear. Then if that is clear, then if we believe that it was during the period of the Mauryan Empire that Brahmi originated. So we have early reference before the coming of the Mauryas that some type of writing existed in Indian subcontinent. So this could mean that the people who existed before the Mauryas were writing in a different script. So it could be Kharosthi, it could be Aramic, or it could even be Greek. Now here, the things become interesting. Now this problem, which the likes, for example, some scholars literally believe that when Panini talks about Lipi, so he is talking about the Aramic script. So this is, some of the assumptions that are made by some scholars. So the problem, for us to say whether what kind of script existed before the Mauryan period becomes quite important and unsolvable up to this period is because we do not have any reference. And most likely, this lack of reference or evidence is because most of the time Indians before the Mauryas wrote their script on perishable materials. So for example, you have a Greek traveler who traveled to the northwestern part of the Indian subcontinent, and his name is Niarchos. So Niarchos, who came to India around the 325 BC, so before Alexander. So he talks about the fact that Indians wrote on cloth. So this is an example to show that most likely the writing that happened before the Mauryas was on perishable materials, and that is why most of these writings does not survive to our present day. Now we could also argue about this lack of evidence by saying that most likely Indians writing was not very popular during before the Mauryas, or not as visible as it was in the case of the Mauryas. Now this example, to prove this point, we could look at the reference of Megasthenes. So Megasthenes tell us that Indians did not know writing characters. So this is the statement by Megasthenes. Now this could suggest, now there are, we have already discussed how there are multiple reference from the time of the later Vedic period to suggest that there was some type of writing that existed in India. And the fact that, Megasthenes is talking about that Indians did not know any characters or did not know writing characters could simply mean, in my view, that writing was not very, very popular or was not prevalent to a great extent that it could be noticed by Megasthenes. Now, this argument could be an interesting argument, but this would suggest that Megasthenes didn't went anywhere, because if we believe that writing was not very common, we are basically saying that in the Mauryan court no one wrote. So because if there was some kind of writing that existed during the court of Chandragupta Maurya, most likely Megasthenes would have seen this type of writing, so he would have not written this statement. Or it could be the case that Megasthenes is basically is talking nonsense here. So whatever the case may be, I think this problem of the fact that before the Mauryas we have literally no reference of the early Brahmi script makes our job of understanding the origin of Brahmi script quite difficult. Now, there are some scholars who argue that from Anuradhapuram, Sri Lanka, we have some, some pottery on which some Brahmi characters are written. Now, the dates vary from 600 BC to 300 BC. And some scholars basically do not believe the dates. And that is why the Brahmi letters of Anuradhapuram are not really, taken into consideration. So if we ignore letters of the Anuradhapuram, we can basically say that before the Mauryan Empire, no script or no writing evidence exist. Now there are two inscriptions, Sohagora and Mahastangad inscription, which some scholars earlier used to believe that it was these inscriptions belonged to the pre-Mauryan phase. And scholars like A.H. Dani and Richard Salomon have worked on these two. Now, these are very small inscriptions, so these are not as extensive as the Mauryan inscription. And from the kind of letters that are used in the Brahmi of these two Mahastangad and Sohagoda inscriptions, scholars so basically A.H. Dani and Richard Salomon believes that most likely these inscriptions were from 2nd century BC. So if that is the case, we find that before the Mauryan Empire, we literally have no evidence of any writing. And this makes our job very difficult to find, who was how Brahmi originated. And I think we have to wait for more evidence to see how Brahmi originated. In one way, I think maybe the decipherment of the Indus Valley script could help solve this whole conundrum. And for this, we have again to wait.